Greetings folks and welcome to another episode of 81632-bit. I'm Rob, and as you've already seen from the thumbnail, today we're looking at the Sega Saturn and why it failed. And rather sadly, it did fail. I know a lot of people really love the Saturn. Hell, I really love the Saturn. I've got two of them. But when it comes down to it, the Saturn was a failure. And there's no escaping that. After the success of the Mega Drive, especially outside of the Japanese market, Sega were looking to capitalise on this by moving into the 32-bit market and getting another massive jump on Nintendo, whose N64 console was still just in the planning processes at this time. Now, let's have a look at the specs of Sega's 32-bit beast before we get into how it affected its market when it came out and what problems there were with it. So, first off, the Sega Saturn was an incredibly complex yet powerful piece of hardware. It featured two Hitachi SH2 chips, very similar to those in the Sega 32X add-on, although these were running at 28.6 MHz. Now the system had 2 MB of system RAM, 1.5 MB of VRAM, which was massive at the time, 512k of sound RAM, and the RAM was also expandable via the cartridge slot, as you would see with some of the releases by Capcom of their arcade fighters. Now there was some inbuilt storage as well, there was some save RAM built in, and you could also again add on to that with a cartridge. The system's graphical display was provided by two separate video chips, VDP1 which handled sprites and polygons, and VDP2 which handled the backgrounds. Audio came from a Yamaha YMF292 chip which had a built-in DSP that ran at 22.6 MHz, and it was capable of 32 channels with both FM synthesis and 16-bit 44.1 kHz PCM audio, as well as streaming audio from its double-speed CD-ROM unit, which was controlled by a dedicated Hitachi SH1 processor. There was also a system control unit with an internal DSP running at 14.3 MHz, and there was a Motorola 68EC000 which helped with the sound subsystem. It had a number of different display resolutions from 320 by 224 all the way up to 704 by 224, and it was capable of displaying 16.7 million colours. Now, those specs all sound brilliant, especially when you lay them down next to, say, its immediate market competitors, the Atari Jaguar and the 3DO. It was clearly a much more powerful piece of kit, and to Sega's credit, it was also a relatively cheaper piece of kit. When launched in Japan in November of 1994, the machine launched at 44,800 yen. When it launched in the United States in May of 1995, it was released to the market at a price of $399.99, and a couple of months later in July of 1995, when it hit the UK market, the price was £399.99. Now, all told, the Saturn was a failure in terms of sales. It sold 9.26 million units approximately worldwide. Now, whilst this is a failure, in its home market, this was actually more of a success than Sega had previously been. It comfortably outsold the Mega Drive in Japan by roughly 2 million units, and it even outsold the N64. Now, if you want to look for positives before we get onto the reasons for failure, the Saturn did have a lot of positives. There were a lot of Sega's incredible arcade games released for the Saturn. You had Daytona, The House of the Dead, Last Bronx, Sega Rally Championship, the Virtua Cop games, some Virtua Fighter games, Virtual On. Capcom threw stuff such as Darkstalkers 3, Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter, and Street Fighter Alpha 3 onto the system. You know, Sega again threw out titles like Fighters Mega Mix, Panzer Dragoon Saga, Guardian Heroes, Panzer Dragoon zwei, Shining Force 3, and a number of games from other systems, i.e. the PlayStation, appeared, such as a port of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, a port of Resident Evil, and ports of the Wipeout games. It also had some pretty impressive stuff if you were into the then burgeoning first-person shooter stroke Doom clone market, with titles such as the lobotomy software Power Slave, Duke Nukem 3D, Quake. You know, it was a pretty solid system, but it still failed. And in a moment, we're going to have a look at why. But that's why it was the success that it was, albeit in a limited form, and especially in the Japanese market. Now, in terms of why the Saturn failed, oh boy. Well, first off, for developers, it was a monstrously complex piece of hardware to use. You had a grand total of 8 different microprocessors that you had to get working in tandem to utilise the system to its best. 2 different display chips, 2 CPUs to run your code on, the sound chip, a controller chip. It was a powerful beast, but a complicated beast. And this did hamstring it. Developers either didn't want to use the system because of its complexity, or never bothered to use the system to even anything approaching the best of its abilities, which meant that games that were developed for the Saturn specifically, where the effort was put in, could look superb, whereas games that were cross-platform often tended to not be quite as good on the Saturn. And certainly some of the features you would expect from a 32-bit system, such as transparencies, were quite complex to do on the Saturn. And that's not that they were impossible, which is a popular internet myth. It was more than possible to do transparencies on the Saturn. VDP2 could certainly do transparencies on the background layers, and with clever coding you could get transparencies into the foreground layers. This is seen in some games such as Astal, and I think even Sonic R has some transparencies and reflection effects which are supposedly impossible on the Saturn, but are there. Another reason that the Saturn was a failure was its high price. All this hardware was expensive, and yes, $399.99 in the US and the UK was cheaper than its immediate competitor, the 3DO, although it was more expensive than the Jaguar. But Sony one-upped Sega with the PlayStation by releasing their machine a full $100 cheaper. Also, in the US, Sega hamstrung themselves by surprise launching the system and only launching it through specific retail partners, which did upset other retailers, including some which, after the surprise launch, refused to carry Saturn hardware or software in a fit of pique, shall we say. This was not good. And of course, with a surprise launch, people aren't ready for it. People don't have the money put aside. They're not ready to spend the money because they may have other stuff to do with it at that time. It was just an ill-conceived plan. And yeah, it was that complexity. Sony made their machine so much easier to code for. They were much more open with it. They actively courted developers and made things as easy as possible for them. They kept the price relatively low compared to Sega's product, and they marketed it better. PlayStation was marketed as the hip, cool, young machine for teenagers and young adults, whereas Sega, despite having had some quite edgy marketing during the Mega Drive and Genesis years, were seen as the old guard alongside Nintendo. They were not cool, they were not hip. Plus, there was a massively heavy reliance on arcade ports. Now, whilst with hindsight we all know these arcade ports are absolutely outstanding, Sega Rally, Virtua Fighter 2, they're brilliant games. The Virtua Cop and House of the Dead ports are outstanding. The breadth and variety of games that hit the PlayStation just gave it more broad appeal. There were new experiences, there were deeper experiences, and whilst the Saturn did have deep games, Panzer Dragoon Saga, Shining Force 3, which spring to mind immediately, it just couldn't compete. And ultimately, Sega pulled the plug, some may argue too early. In the West, Sega pulled the plug on the Saturn in 1998 with the build-up to the launch of the Dreamcast. However, the Saturn did carry on for another 2 years in Japan officially, and as I said, that was its most successful market. More than half of all hardware units sold for the Saturn were sold in Japan. It was a comparatively huge success there, although, you know, it was a distant second in what was ultimately a two-horse race. Now, that's not to say the Saturn was bad. It didn't fail because it was bad, it failed because of Sega's own poor handling of the system. They just didn't get it right. They had an amazing market that they could have taken a real grip of in the West, and they completely failed to do so. Yes, we should also mention the 32X. That did confuse the market somewhat, but I think somewhat less than people would have you believe, given that that system sold less than 1 million units and was on the market for barely a year. But Sega just fumbled. They'd been fumbling the ball ever since the release of the Mega CD. Then there was the 32X and the Saturn, and finally the Dreamcast, which we will get to in another video. But that's why the Sega Saturn failed. Bad management, bad pricing, lack of games. Now, if you have your own opinion on this, if you want to disagree with me, if you think there are other reasons, feel free to leave a comment down below. If you like this video, hit that like button. If you really enjoyed what you've seen, hit the subscribe button. If you really like it, ring that bell. In a moment, you'll see my end card, which has got my social media, my Ko-fi, my Patreon. You know, let me know what you think. If you enjoyed it, if you didn't. But anyway, I'm Rob. This is 81632-bit, and that was why the Sega Saturn failed.